What I had in mind was a little bit of endgame analysis. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of thinking we'll see kind of what people are interested in terms of endgames, but I have a few from this classic basic chess endgames book, and I sort of wanted to run through those. The rook and pawn endgames. Again, I think this is pretty good instructional material, but at the same time, you know, if you guys are more interested in playing or doing anything like that, I'm open to that as well. But anyways, looking at these rook and pawn endgames, I think what's kind of important here is that this position is a draw. This is kind of complicated. This is interesting. But basically, if the rook is in front of the pawns here, so we're taking a king and pawn endgame where there is a where there's basically two pawns and a rook that's on the 8th file blocking the pawn on b7. Basically the phrase they use is the lack of mobility here makes it impossible to win. So the black king remains at g7, and it can't really be driven off of this king to b7 file. Basically here, any move from white is going to make his situation worse. So what you can do is play, if you're black here, you have the defensive tactic, king to h7, king to g7, king to h7, basically back and forth on these two pawns. You know, the issue that comes up is if the king goes to somewhere like f7, then the rook can potentially play to h8, and then if rook takes b7, then rook to h7 skewer, and that skewer. Hey, good morning, Kiro. How are you? How's it going? So yeah, so basically this skewer, this king to f7 skewer. Hey, what's up? Good to see you, Vishal. We were looking at our rook and pawn endgames. But yeah, so here, this king to h7, king to g7 combination is a defensive resource for black that will provide a draw here, since the rook will never be able to move away and will never be able to move off of this file and skewer effectively. So it basically just goes to h7 or c7. And basically the rook, the defensive resource, if black is looking for a defensive resource, is basically capitalizing on the mobility, or basically the lack of mobility here. So the idea, basically is to move king h7 or king g7, but have the king end up on g7. But the rook can basically just move, rook to b2. I don't know. It's up to you. It's up to you, Kira. That's a fair question. I don't know. That's up to you. I mean, if you look at it from a purely mercenary standpoint, isn't all of chess kind of a waste of time? I mean, this is something that's fun for me to do. I enjoy doing this. So for me, it's never a waste of time, right? If it's fun for you to do, then it's not a waste of time. But that's up to you. That's good though. Cool. So yeah. Just keep the king at g7 and move the rook along this file. I mean, I don't know if I could do it, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. It's a good question though. It's a cool trick. I don't know. There's many things in chess that don't immediately have value. But I don't know. I've never tried doing that, Kiro. So your guess is as good as mine. But yeah. So basically, keep the king at g7, and then just move the rook on the b file. And the white king, and basically the white won't be able to make any progress. So if we actually want to play out a game here, the king can just be held at g7, right? King at g7, so the king stays here. And then if it's white to move, then white will try to advance the pawn. So king here, rook here, king here, rook here, king here, rook here, king here, rook here, king here. I mean, it basically there's no way for white to make any progress, right? Basically the rook just doesn't move. That's the point of it, or the king just doesn't move. So basically there's no way for no way for the white rook to get away. Can't you just take the pawn with check and move back? I'm not sure I understand the question. The king stays on G7 here. Where the king was on G3 and the king G5. Well, let's go back to the beginning. So here, this is the position, right? Rook takes G3, Rook to B3. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I follow. But basically, the point is, the king can move. You know, basically, there's no effective. If black maintains the king on G7, there's no effective structure that wins for white. Like, there's no way that white can get in here. And similarly, if the king tries to get in here, right? So if the king goes to C7, then basically the rook can start checking as a tactic. There's nothing that the king can do, right? Because if the king's far enough on, or the rook's far enough on this file, you know, there's basically never going to be a way for the king to advance here. Just needs to keep checking is the main point. So yeah. This is the situation where this king basically needs to stay on G7. Nothing should be moving the king off of G7 when the pawns are this, or when the king is this advanced. But if the king ever tries to provide defense to the pawn, then the rook checks it away from the pawn. You see what I'm saying? It's basically like a you know, there's no point at which this king is ever going to allow defense that will allow this rook to move off of this this B8 file. This is a really good demonstration of kind of the you know, the value of having the king off of you know, basically it shows a really good value of having the king not be on or the rook be behind the pawn as opposed to in front of the pawn. Can't we simply approach the rook with the king to drive it off of the file? Yeah, but the thing about it is the rook can bounce between B1 and B2. So if at any point the king tries to get closer to the pawn, so say, you know, this type of thing, like king to A3, then the rook can just go back to B6. The file is too yeah, so this endgame, right, is you know, basically the rook will move to the other side of where the king is. This file is open enough that that the rook can always use moving to B6 as a resource if the king gets close. So like here, you know, rook to B6, king A4, rook to B1, and then the king's sort of stuck, right? So this, you know, basically this, you know, king can never, you know, can never successfully approach the rook. So there's no way to advance here. I mean, this is pretty interesting, right? Let's start over again from the beginning position. But you can see if the king stays on G7, there's no effective way that white can improve his position. If the rook is in front of the pawn. So basically, what this implies is that, you know, having your rook on a B8 square in front of the pawn, there's no way to win there. And if the king ever tries to defend the pawn, like say C6, rook to c2, rook to b2, rook to a6. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's actually pretty, this is actually pretty interesting. So the rook can just bounce up and down. Basically, in this type of situation, the rook should never leave the b file, and the king should never leave the g7. Really interesting though, right? So I think that, I mean, if I've convinced, basically on this idea, the rook should never leave the b file unless the king is on these 3 squares. And the king should never leave g7. So that's the important part. So the interesting thing in this situation is that it's actually, if we look at a different starting position, if we look at the pawn on b6, this actually makes all the difference, right? This is surprising, but basically in this case, white can win by getting his king into b7. That's what's really, kind of interesting and different about this. So in this case, king to g3, king to f7, king to f4, king to g7, king to e5, king to f7, king to d6, and now eventually this, unlike the previous situation, white's going to be able to do like the kind of, I don't remember, is it called loose? It's some type of position where basically the rook gets in front of the pawn. So eventually what's going to happen is the rook's going to move to c6 here. So king here, king here, king here, king here, rook here. And then king over, rook there, king, king over, king there. And then go up like that. So it really makes all the difference of whether the pawn is on the 7th rank or the 6th rank. But yeah, I just want to make sure that we fully understand on this. Basically, there's no way, the king should stay on g7, the rook should move along the b file, and there should never be a difference, in this case. So, king here, rook here, king here. So that's what happens if the rook is in front of the pawn. It provides this resource for black, and basically, the rook should stay on the b file, unless the king goes to those 3 squares. Those 3 squares are these 3 right here. So, interesting. Yeah, so anyways, that is an interesting outcome. Wouldn't necessarily be that surprising, but yeah, the b6 provides an area for the king to go in that's not available if the pawn is on b7. There's no way to get the there's no way to get the king to defend the pawn here. Whereas here, the b7 square will provide a resource for the king to go to defend the pawn. So, anyways, interesting situation. Yeah, I wanted to take a look at another one. This is basically a forced win. This is a Marshall game from 1928. All right. So, in this game, white starts off with his king on basically it's black to move here. And black's king is on h7, white's king is on h3. And in this case, basically it's like an idea where, there's basically 4 one of the things that Fine likes doing in this very old book is he likes doing 4 different things. He divides the winning strategy into 4 situations here. The 4 strategies are: white guards the black passed pawn, which is this one, by placing the rook behind it. Okay? So white guards, basically white guards the passed pawn by placing the rook behind it. So here, rook to a6, because this pawn is going this direction. So white gets the key defensive move, basically defensive move with the rook behind the pawn. And here, the second move is, with the help of both king and rook, he advances his own pawns as far as possible, Okay, so that's basically he gets his king up to b4, and then he starts moving these pawns forward as far as he can. Um, Basically, if black, if black moves his rook to a different file than this one, so right here, this rook is providing defense on this file. So if the rook leaves that file, then black then white captures the pawn, right? So the rook is basically tied to the 5th rank here. And if the black rook doesn't try to stop the pawns, then white's just going to keep pushing the pawns. So let's go. Let's take a look at how, so just in case just in case I explained it in too long-winded a way, white basically guards the black pawn by getting the best defense possible. That's the defense of the rook behind the pawn. The second one is so if he can use both the king and rook, he advances his own pawns as far as he can. So that's f4, e4, and advancing pawns with like e5, e6, f5, those moves. If black prevents further advance by moving the rook, then a queen gets forced. And then and if the black rook does not try to stop the pawns, then white can force the queen. So let's look at that. King g7, king g3, king f7, f4, and basically white's going with this idea. Basically the rook shouldn't move. If the rook moves, white will immediately take rook to a6 and defend in that direction. And white will basically keep pushing pawns here. So this this ends up being a win for white. White has successfully pushed his pawns as far as they need, but let's go slower on this. So king to g7, king to g3, and basically the defensive resource for white is going to be rook to a6, and white's just going to keep pushing his pawns. This is unusual. Basically, this rook to a6, this king has forced this rook off of this defensive square, but white still wins because his pawns are so advanced in this case. So rook basically blocks off everything. And it ends up being a win for white. So a win for white in this case. This shows the value of the connected passed pawns versus the versus the rook. It also shows kind of better value and good placement here. But yeah, anyways, it ends up being a winning rook and pawn endgame. Makes sense. Let's take a look at a few other endgames. I think we can set these ones up, and let's do it. Okay. So, on to a new one. So let's take a look at this one. So here, basically white is, basically white's to play, but unlike the previous situation, he doesn't have nearly the same amount of resources behind him. So king to d4, rook to a4 check, king to d3, rook to a8, and here basically, king to e4. Rook to f8, king to d4. Actually, sorry, I should do it loaded. That makes more sense. So hey, welcome, Anch. How are you? So yeah, king to d4, king to d3, rook to a8, king to e4, rook to f8, king to d4, g4, rook to g1, rook to f4, king e3, rook to f5, and here basically it's a draw. So you know, there's no real way for white to advance this. On rook takes, and basically the king can play to e7 and have a draw here. But yeah, so I hope these endgames are helpful. Again, like we can just keep going through them. Yeah. So basically, this is old rook and pawn endgame stuff. But yeah, I think in general pretty good. You know, pretty good and effective ways of teaching this. If anyone has any questions on these, you know, please let me know. You know, honestly, I'm super happy to go over these alone, so I'm just like chilling. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions. This is these are rook and pawn endgames. I don't know. That's up to you, Kiro. But you know, honestly, I think it's kind of I don't know. How's the server doing, by the way? Yeah. So yeah, in this situation, black to play, white wins. So black to play, white wins. Cool. Best defense is rook to... Okay, so black to play and white wins. So rook to b6, rook to a8, king to e7, f6, king e6, rook e8, king d5, king h6, rook to b1, rook to e8 check, king to d5, king to h6, rook to b1, king to g7, rook to b7, rook to e7. And then this pawn on f6 is going to get clipped. But yeah, interesting. But yeah, so these rook and pawn endgames are good. Yeah. Um, in general, I guess I don't know. I guess the main thing about it is kind of uh, I don't know. I've talked to a few kind of high level grandmasters, and it seems like a bad idea to kind of overpress positions. It's just a little bit silly. Like you want to keep your pieces harmonious, right? So if you start overpressing your positions or trying to force things that don't make sense, you're going to end up tangled, and your pieces are going to deteriorate pretty quickly. So I guess that's my kind of main idea on that. Like, play in a way that keeps everything harmonious. If you overpress, that can be dangerous. In terms of visualization, I guess what I would say, the issue with visualization is, I guess the most blunt way to do that is, start doing more tactics. But yeah, I think tactical study is probably the most effective way to do that. If you want to go into more and more advanced tactics, you can do that on chesstempo.com. But yeah, the main idea is, don't force things that aren't possible, or if you start to force things that kind of aren't possible, or don't really make sense, things will very quickly deteriorate. So that's my idea. Just keep everything, keep your pieces harmonious, copacetic. If you start, overpressing positions, you're going to end up in a situation in which, your position will deteriorate quickly. That's my advice on that. And don't, I don't know, just don't worry about it. Play in a way that is the most fitting for yourself. But otherwise, it's sort of like, why, if you're in a situation where all the pieces are together, the material is equal, and basically things are fine, then don't overpress it. That is the biggest mistake that I see people making. If you just continue to keep everything kind of calm, normal, no issues, you're fine. But if you get into a situation in which your position can't your position can't be held together, you've disrupted kind of the way that things were, the way that things were kind of all in balance. Those are the positions that I really see people throw away. That's the part that doesn't really make much sense to me. But I see people do it all the time. So what can you really say about that? Anyways, I was thinking we could do a few more rook and pawn end games, and that should be helpful. But visualization, that's up to you. Um, yeah, but I mean, you only get these positions once, right? So that's the kind of, you basically you don't get to retry it. Uh, so But yeah, I think that's right. I think what you're saying, Anch, is correct. Basically, if you end up in a situation where uh, you basically considering all consider your response against best play. If your opponent plays in the perfectly rational way, then expect that, right? I mean, you're playing against the engine. The engine doesn't really have any, the engine has no biases. So yeah, that's my take on that. And imagine best play, basically. Don't play gimmicky moves expecting them to not work, or expecting them to you know, work out. Like, don't expect your opponent to be cooperative, I guess, is my main point. The engine is perfectly rational. It's not cooperative. So what's helpful in doing an analysis is, you know, the engine will respond optimally to all cheap threats. And if you play cheap threats against the engine, it'll just kind of, you know, immediately capitalize on them. So that's my take on that. And that is, you know, basically imagine best play is what I'm saying, Anch. Good question, though. So, anyways, oh, yeah, I understand. I understand what you're saying, Anch. Basically, what I would say on that type of situation is, yeah, I mean, ideally, yeah, you're seeing everything into its conclusion. In is the goal. You know, in practice, especially in the timed tactics, like in the puzzle battle type tactics or puzzle rush, you know, having the expectation of solving things completely is not realistic. But yeah, you know, you should be able to see kind of what the outcome is. So yeah, that's my take on that. You know, basically, you should try to see as far as you can. You know, it depends on your tactics trainer. In chess tempo, what I would say is see things to the end. But in puzzle battle, puzzle rush, play a more compromising. You know, basically play a move that compromises accuracy to some degree. That's the question. So yeah, let's take a look at some more of these rook endgames. Here's another one. Cool. Yeah, so basically black's to play here and white wins. So I'll start it like one move off, I guess. This thing always thinks it's white to move when you load it. But yeah, so in this situation, black to move, white wins. So rook a3, king d4. Rook takes g3, rook to c8. So white wins here by basically blocking with his rook. Playing this from front to back again. King e3, rook to a3, king d4. So I guess it's this maneuvering. This maneuvering on rook to a5 is important. I'm trying to think of what the key characteristics or what the main idea of learning in this position is. But I guess what's useful for white in this situation is getting the rook to the side of the pawn as opposed to in front. It's not really that, basically if you're going to rank, how good versus bad rook defense on a pawn is, getting the rook behind the pawn, like this rook, is the best for both sides. Having the rook behind the pawn is worse for both sides, so like white here in this situation. And basically white wins this game by promoting his, or by basically improving his rook's defense of the pawn to being a lateral defense as opposed to a defense that's behind the pawn. The fact that he can do this with check is helpful. So yeah, so let's look. So here, so rook a3 check. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, WM. I appreciate it. Thank you. But yeah, so this block, in this puzzle, white goes from having his rook behind the pawn to his rook adjacent to the pawn to his rook in front of the king, and this ends up playing out well for white. So rook plays to a5, and this rook's on a1, and basically, with rook takes, king takes a5, queen, a8, queen. So, yeah, looks like a win for white. I think the key part of this was, I think the placement of these pawns is always, or the placement of the king relative to each other, is always important. This king had quicker mobility to the queen side than black's king did. I'm not sure if king to a3 was a mistake. We can look at other situations here. So here it's rook to a3 was the first move. I'm not sure if rook to a3 was right. Let's look at this instead. But I think that white is just always a pawn, or white is just always a tempo ahead in terms of getting over to the queen side. So I think getting to the queen side is the important part. If we're doing this, this basically is a good way of white to get over to the queen side here and establish things. So, good. Yeah, good play by white. So, I don't know, interesting. That ends up being a situation where white is better. And, yeah, rook takes, king takes. It was an improvement of the rook's defense of the pawn at all points. We can look at a few more. So basically, rooks belong behind pawns instead of in front of them. That's I think basically one of the main purposes of explaining in this chapter. We can go over a few other GM level rook and pawn endgames. I like looking at these. Oh, cool. That's neat. Yeah, thanks for that, Anch. Yeah, this is the same type of material for sure. My hope is that, there will be more of these. But yeah, there's 4. If the goal is to get, yeah, so, I mean, it's one of these questions. It's sort of kind of ridiculous to kind of compare these things. I'm doing these rook and pawn endgames for myself, to be honest. Let's check this out. But yeah, Anch, you're definitely going for something here. I just don't know what it is. Basically, king's here, pawn's here, pawn's here, pawn's here. Yeah, so that's helpful. Yeah, we can go through these, sure. Yeah, I like it. The thing about this is someone else's content. That's the only thing that I would be concerned about here, actually, to be honest. Now that you've brought it up, Anch, I think this might be an excellent resource, but I don't think it would be a great idea for me to go through someone else's content on the stream. That's where I kind of am, you know, that's what I'm kind of questioning. That seems like a bad idea, to be honest. Yeah, you know, all the books that I look at and all the books that I present on the stream are public domain. So yeah, I'm always very cautious about these types of things. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's good. I'm glad. Yeah, but yeah, feel free to go through that one. I'm sure that's also a good free resource. Feel free. But yeah. But yeah, no, feel free. I'm sure it's an excellent resource. I just wouldn't want to, you know, I just wouldn't want to present it in a way that's, I mean, you know, I could probably reach out and ask for it, or you could reach out and ask for it, actually, Anch. But yeah, I don't feel comfortable presenting someone else's material on the stream. All the books that I go through are public domain, and that's the most important thing to me. Yeah, so white wins in this situation. This is another one. This is Lasker Rubinstein from 1914. So here, Black's Rook is, you know, basically Black's Rook is forced, you know, stuck on this, you know, on defending on this file, and this Rook is here, or this pawn is here. In this case, f5 provides the best resource for white. f5, g takes f5, g takes f5, rf6, rf4, b4, b3, rook to f7, f6, king d6, king d4, king e6, rook f2, king d6, rook a2. So this is basically this advancement to the king on this side. Rook c7, rook a6, king d7, rook b6. And here, basically, Black resigns the situation. This king is going to take this pawn on d5, but this king's going here, and after the king goes to it goes to e8, then king takes d5. So here, white's just better. So let's look at the situation again. Sorry, I should have loaded it as opposed to just played it out. But king here, pawn here, pawn here. F5, g takes, rook f6, rook f4, b4, b3, rook f7, 6, king to d6, king to d4, king e6, a2, rook c7, Okay. And basically black resigned here. Let's go through it again. F5, pawn takes, rook f6, rook to f4, and white is pressing here. So yeah, sounds good. After rook a2, what if rook takes g6? Then here, really good question. Thank you for asking it, Sam Sejwani. So rook takes f6. Thank you for, no, really, thank you for the question. Sam Sejwani asks, after rook a2, what if rook takes f6? Rook here, rook here, king here, king takes, and this king's going to be able to seize the opposition and advance the pawn. So the best defense for black here is this, then here, 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 and white has basically outmaneuvered the king. So yeah, so that was the that's a really good question. Thank you very much for asking it. Feel free to ask questions. You know, endgame study in particular gets dry if people don't ask questions. But yeah, so this ends up playing out great for you know, playing out great for white. So yeah. White just outmaneuvers the king and wins. That was the point. That was a key factor. So I thank you for asking it and giving me the opportunity to go over it. Yeah. So yeah, that was the thing. Anyways, I guess what I would say here is basically, you know, this, you know, there are many, you know, rook and pawn endgames. Getting experience in it is very helpful. I haven't looked at the endgame trainer and if they have rook and pawn endgames specifically on there. My guess is that they don't, but looking at chess.com's endgame trainer could be a helpful way to look at that. And yeah. So yeah, I guess my idea here is just you know, keep playing the way that things are, and you know, go through as many of these as you can. Asking questions like Sam Sejwani did is super helpful. But with that, I want to go. You know, we looked at about 5 or 6 rook and pawn endgames. With that, I want to go into the games for this morning. Cool. Determined Vision's game is black. So white plays this early, you know, white plays this early bishop to f4. Here, I think we've talked about it before, but knight c6 is well down this list in terms of popularity of moves for, you know, popularity of moves for black here. Knight to c6 just causes problems. I don't think you want to have knight to c6. You can probably play c6 or c5. I think this is a better strategy for black here. With knight to c6, e3, bishop to f5, bishop to d3, and bishop takes, queen takes, e6. This ends up being a better situation for black, and you know, this is a better way to you know, this is a better way to play. Basically, white is exploiting this this limited ability of this knight to move. c4 comes on the next move or two for white, and black doesn't have a good response. The best response is this Queen's Gambit orthodox exchange, or basically e6. But here, you know, white's doing fine. You know, the knight to c6 is an unchallenging move for white. So I recommend not playing knight to c6 here. Mainline moves here: knight to f6, c5, e6. So I think that these will all be better plays for black in terms of this opening theory. Knight to c6 holds back the c7 pawn. Bishop takes, queen takes, e6, bishop to d6, and black's fine here. This ends up being roughly equal for black. A5, knight d2, castles, e4. sure. I mean, this is fine. White is also playing in a relatively unchallenging way. On knight to c6, best for white is probably like moves like knight to f3. That's not what white played. White played e3 instead. E3 is fine. E3 does move white towards development, but I think that this is going to be a situation in which there's going to be bishop-heavy development. I'm not sure about bishop to d3. I think bishop to d3 is probably fine, but I like the idea with white getting more aggressively developed here. Knight takes, queen takes, bishop to h4. And yeah, the main error here comes with f5. If we look at f5 as a move, the eval shifts pretty aggressively against, knight to g5. With knight to g5, black ends up better. f5 provides this resource which traps the knight, and yeah, should end up in a situation that's better for black here. I think we've looked at this game before as well. I think it got duplicated, so yeah, let's take a look at another. Here's Sam Sejuani's game. In Sam Sejuani's game, he gets this early, basically Italian game against his opponent, and he plays the Evans Gambit. Cool. So we've established, right? Evans Gambit is best with bishop takes b4. With bishop takes b4, c3, and bishop to c5. This tends to be good for white. I think that in this situation, white does better off of bishop to c5. Bishop to c5, I think, is less good a move than bishop to a5. In terms of popularity, bishop to a5 is about 4 times more popular than bishop to c5. With bishop to c5, then d4 can end up d4, pawn takes d4, bishop e7, and basically black is kind of on the retreat here. White has this solid center. Black doesn't really have any chances. Ideas like bishop to d2, castles. No, I mean, I don't think this is bad so far. I think this has been fine for you, Sam Sejuani. b4, bishop takes b4, c5. d4, pawn takes. Interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't think there's, certainly from this point, I don't think there's any problems for white. Queen to b3 is probably better, but yeah, e5, d5, knight takes. Yeah, better for white. What happened here? This gets really confusing. So this position becomes super tactical. Let's look at what happens. So just so we know, let's get the Evans Gambit theory right first. c3 and then bishop to c5. On bishop to c5, both castles and d4 provide good positions for white. d4 is fine. d4 has a slightly better winning percentage. Fine, sure. Instead, castles. Yeah, so d4 is considered to be better than castles by the engine. So d4, and then moves for black include e takes d4. Then castles is possible. C takes d4 is possible. On c takes d4, and let's just see it in terms of relative value. C takes d4 is better. C takes d4, and then bishop to b6 or bishop to b4 are the moves for black. Bishop to e7 is not a move for black here. In terms of eval, bishop to e7 is worse than bishop to b4 or bishop to b6. I think bishop to b4 is considered to be the best, but bishop to e7 is just a straightforward retreating move. Now white has a better center. Bishop to d2, bishop to f6. And e5 is a good move here. I like this. I think white's played this in a fine way. White's up by about 3 pawns here. I'm just sort of confused. Knight takes e5, and white is now up a piece. So, yeah, I would play probably castles is better. on knight to d3, queen takes a1, queen to h5. White is looking fine. But yeah, look, there's a lot of volatility in this. So yeah, Sam Serjwani, this comes down to tactical play. I'm not sure in terms of how much improvement. I think that this is going to be a mostly tactically oriented improvement here. But let's see. B4, fine. Evans Gambit. D4, pawn takes, sure. Bishop E7, and now white is okay. Bishop to D2 is considered to be slightly worse than castling, but not by too much. And bishop to E2 also makes intuitive sense. So castling is given a better objective eval than bishop to D2, but I think they're both fine. E5, bishop E7, D5, knight takes. And here I have to start thinking that white's going to have some tactical opportunities. D6 I think is probably good for white. D6, and then maybe knight to H6 could be the response for black. On knight to H6, bishop takes H6. But yeah, D6 was played in this game. I like D6 a lot. I think this makes a lot of sense for white. Again, I don't think there's any problems for Sam Serjwani here. I think he's played this correctly. Queen to F6, and then here, Engine is suggesting castles. I think that's probably good. But this bishop takes H6 was a blunder. Instead, bishop to C3. This is a complicated tactic, honestly. I wouldn't expect someone to see this. This is difficult to see. Basically, directly sacrificing the queen. So queen takes B1, king to D2, and then on that, there's many threats for white. Here, probably queen takes A1. Queen to E5 mates. Mate in 4 is king to F8. And white's just better. White ends up winning checkmating here, and that's good. So yeah, I don't think you made any errors, Sam Serjwani. I think you're looking fine. Like in this situation, white's basically up 4 pawns, 7 pawns now. I don't think you messed this up. Looks fine to me. You saw the discover check on F7 by the bishop if you play D6. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Sam Serjwani. I think that's what makes D6 the correct play. With D6, you have this pressure on F7. And things are good. Yeah, overall, I think this is a fine game. I saw that the accuracy score is very low, but at the same time, I don't think this is one where accuracy clearly. I don't think accuracy gives a good reading on this game. This F7 pawn, I think makes white completely fine here. Bishop to C3 is probably an improvement. So I think in terms of improving this game, Sam Serjwani, what you've done so far makes sense. I think bishop to C3 is a better way to do this. Bishop to C3 just wins the queen directly, you can worry about mating threats later, but what's really most important is that you secure an effective win. So I would say bishop to C3 holds the queen, basically moves the queen to A1, and now this bishop is about to checkmate, or the queen is in checkmate more or less. So winning this game with bishop to C3, I think that ends up being good for white. Uh, but yeah, just looking at this theory, just since Evans Gambit theory, not super. I'm not I never played the Evans Gambit. C3 looks forced. Then there's three options. So bishop to a5, bishop to e7, and bishop to c5. Of these three, bishop to a5 is the most common. So let's take a look at the bishop to a5 theory. Bishop to a5, White's response is d4, e takes, castles, d6, c takes, and White is in pretty good pretty good position with this solid center. Black's strongest part of this position is this bishop on this bishop facing e1. This is one where I don't trust the analysis particularly well. I think knight to f6 is an idea. On this, knight f6 appears to be the only one that leads to lead for black. This is kind of interesting. This is a break between black's optimal play and so basically here optimal play as given by the engine is knight to f6, knight to f6, and then queen to a4 probably. But we're in a situation where knight to f6 is giving given a better eval by the engine. Engine eval sees knight f6 as black being ahead here. Maybe this makes sense. I mean, White has sacrificed a pawn in this situation. But overall, I just sort of want to learn this, I just want to sort of learn the theory for Evans Gambit a little better. So I think we can take about 10 minutes and do this. Overall, Sam Sejuani, since we're sort of moving into theory from your game, I think you played a good game. I think that probably playing to win the queen was slightly earlier was good, but it became a tactical game in which there's, I don't really necessarily have that much to add until after it becomes a tactical position. The engine can determine tactics, and I think it finds something, which is that early bishop to c3 was probably slightly better for White. That said, I like the way that you played that game. It made sense, and I don't think Black ever really had too many opportunities. So overall, good. I don't think that was badly played. I think that was pretty well played for the Evans Gambit. But I want to look at the kind of the main forks in this theory. So the moves are bishop to a5, bishop to e7, bishop to c5. Bishop to c5 is played, then d4 is played, c takes d4, c takes d4, and then I think we're at another forking point. So we can go to bishop to b6, or we can go to bishop to b4. These are both good for black. So I don't know. It's up to black to decide what to do. Bishop a5 is probably fine. d4, e takes, and here castles is the main move for White. Castles, d6, although there's many options for black, including d6, d takes c6, knight ge7, bishop to b6, knight f6. There's many black has many choices here. Thematically speaking, I think this bishop. So basically, the main line here, and this is a very common Evans Gambit line, is bishop to b6. Engine determines knight to f6 to be better than bishop to b6, but here the main line, as determined by theory, is bishop to b6, which puts pressure on this e4, the d4 pawn. So bishop to b6, and then there's d5, knight c3, bishop to b2. These are all considered to be good for White. d5, knight a5, bishop to b2, knight e7, bishop to d3. And by the way, this bishop on c4 was never hanging because on knight takes c4, queen to a4, and then this double check between the king and the knight. Castles, knight c3, knight g6, knight to e2, c5. But White's looking fine. I think overall this situation is pretty much, this situation, I guess White's still down a pawn. So this is probably relatively good play for black, but a fully playable game from either side. White's going to have this attack on the king side now and hopefully get that pawn back, or more. But that's sort of what White's looking at in this Evans Gambit. So let's look at the bishop to e7 lines. That I'm kind of curious about too, because bishop e7 is actually the second most common move here. Here, early d4s, knight to a5. After knight takes c4, bishop takes g7 was the best move. Maybe. Let's look. So let's go back to that line. Bishop c4, d4. Yeah, let's go through bishop takes g7. Good. Yeah, no. Thanks for participating, Sam Sejwani, for sure. Let's see. Yeah, sorry. Let's go back to this theory. Just trying to pick it up on this thing. Here. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Knight takes c4, bishop takes g7 is better. I was just looking at queen to a4 because this forks the king and knight. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Bishop takes g7 is better than queen to a4 here. With bishop takes g7, this bishop's taking the rook the next move, and white is up. White has multiple threats here. This knight will probably need to go back to a5, but multiple problems for black. But yeah, I think you're right. Bishop takes g7 is better than queen to a4. Thank you for, yeah, no, thank you for catching that. To be honest, super helpful. If I make errors, like definitely bring them up. Like yeah, So this bishop to g7 and the bishop to a5 variation. So just to do this again, bishop to a5, d4, castles, d6, pawn takes, knight f6. Instead, bishop to b6, which is the main line, d5, and then on knight a5, bishop to b2, and the immediate knight takes c4 is an error for black. Knight to e7 is the knight to e7 is the move. Here, white will still need to deal with, white will still need to deal with, so on bishop to b2, knight to e7, bishop takes g7 is no longer a threat. White now needs to deal with moving the bishop to an undefended square. What is so bad with queen to a4? Yeah, good question. So bishop to b2, knight takes c4, and then queen to a4. It's a really good question too, Anch, for sure. Bishop d7, queen takes c4, knight to f6. So black basically gets an extra tempo to defend the g7 pawn. But Sam Sejwani is completely right. I thought queen a4 was right, and instead bishop takes g7 was the move. So that was better. Yeah, right. So that's right. But good questions by both of you guys here. Like, totally feel free. You know, these lessons are supposed to be, you know, for the public good, like for your guys to participate and to be helped. So yeah, I guess what I would say here is just this. You know, there's many lines in the Evans Gambit here, and you're picking up on a good thing, which is this bishop takes g7 was the correct response, not queen to a4. Pawn takes, bishop to e7. But yeah, so in terms of ranking these three options, bishop to a4, bishop to c5, bishop to e7, these all tend to end up being playable, for sure. Yeah, so c3, bishop to a5, d4, e takes d4. So it looks like pretty much regardless. Let's just come up with, I think, a larger opening principle here. In this Evans Gambit, it seems like every time for white, d4 is a very playable move, probably objectively the best move. So on a5, still d4. On bishop to c5, still d4. On bishop to e7, still d4. So basically, d4 is the correct response in each situation for white. I don't know if that, in terms of an opening principle, that might be an obvious one, but I think that that's worth kind of noting, that d4 is always the response. After c3, bishop moves, it's always d4. So bishop a5, d4, e takes, and then in this one where the pawn is actually pinned, castles, and then black has a lot of options. d6, then c takes d4, d takes c3, then queen to b3, and this threat on f7 is big. So queen f6, e5, queen g6, knight takes c3, knight g7, bishop a3, and basically white's looking fine. This ends up being, this is a very common Evans Gambit line. But I think what's really worth taking away from this is, just so we get the most basic fundamentals right. If b4, bishop takes b4, c3, on any move by the bishop here, you play d4 on the next move. The least overwhelming case is on the bishop to c5 idea, but still, d4 is the best objective move for white here. E takes, and then either castles is available or c takes, but c takes is considered to be better by the engine. White makes these direct threats with d4. They're solid, they're good. And then black, has to choose between retreating his bishop or moving it to b4. The bishop to b4 line is the line that I was the most curious about, because I couldn't remember exactly how this worked. On bishop to b4, king to f1. This is an interesting situation. It's a Evans Gambit or McDonald. I guess they call it McDonald defense of the Italian game, but yeah, it's actually this is a book line here. It's funny, I've seen these, but not in many years. So c takes, bishop to b4, and then on bishop to b4, king f1 is the move. So queen e7, e5, f6, e takes, knight takes, bishop to g5. And white's in good shape. This, was better for white maybe on f6, a3. Okay, so a3 was a better response than e takes f6. That makes sense. So I guessed f6 was correct, but it's not. A3 is better. F6 clogs this knight's development. This knight can't develop to this square. So if white plays e takes f6, then this is a situation that improves black's development of the knight. Instead, a3, and this will be good for white. So yeah. c3, d4, strong. e5 looks good. Bishop to e7, d5, knight takes, and yeah, I think white's in a situation where white is better by about 7 points. That's what happened in the game. But yeah, I like it. Yeah, it looks good. So that's the main takeaway from this. Sam Sejuani played a good game out of the Evans Gambit. He followed the principle correctly. But I do actually think it's worth kind of noting what this principle is, which is basically on c3, the Evans Gambit goes c3, and then regardless of where the bishop goes, you play d4 on the next move. That's always objectively the best for white. Interesting, maybe intuitive, but if we can lay down a rule, I think we can benefit from that. It's a pretty good guideline. All right, here's the next one. Last game, this is from TK. All right, so this is TK's game. He plays white, he plays the Italian game. He plays the Evans Gambit as well. Interesting. Cool. Bishop takes c3 and then d4. So he followed this principle, early d4. Now since people are playing this, c takes d4, and castles is, basically the only move here. This is a situation in which white plays best by castling. Let's look at the engine. I'm sure that's correct. Castles is objectively the best. Queen to b3, which is the second most popular move, is closely behind. So castles, and then c takes d4, bishop to b6, c takes d4, this is main line. On castles, main line is bishop to b6. Or no, it's not. Okay, so on castles, main line is d6. So there's a few different options out of this bishop a5 castling line. d6 is one, d takes c3 is one, knight to e7, bishop to b6, knight to f6. All seem to be played pretty frequently. On d takes c3, response should be queen to b3. This threatens on f7, queen f6, e5, queen g6, knight takes c3, knight to e7, bishop a3. White's looking fine. No issues here. White has strong development of his bishops, good diagonals for himself, and white is up slightly. So yeah. b4, c3, d4, castles. Now a bunch of different options for white. On d takes c3, queen b3. On the engine is suggesting knight f6, which is the 5th most popular move. Yeah, that is interesting. Evan's Gambit is always cool to look at. This is opening. I know it's relatively playable as white, but yeah, it is interesting. We get to really learn this theory better since they're together. Castles, bishop b6, c takes d4, and now white's. I have to think this is good for white. Yeah. Here d6, d5, knight a5, bishop to b2. This is the line that we were looking at. Here, knight to e7, and bishop to d3. Castles, knight c3, knight g6, knight e2. And now white's going to start this attack on the king side, and black, is up a pawn. But white's going to have a fairly legitimate attack. I think that this will end up being a little bit better for black because a pawn is a valuable sacrifice to make. Like, if you lose a pawn, that tends to be a position-altering situation. But yeah, basically here, white's going to try to go in with a kingside attack, and whether or not the Evans Gambit is a playable gambit for you depends on how comfortable you are trying to improve on the kingside here. So let's go through the actual game, though. We see it's the Evans Gambit, so we can do more on the theory here. This bishop to b6 is one of the most common moves. C takes the center. D5 by the way, is a book attack, the most common one. D5, knight to e7, and then I think e5. Yeah, so this is all actually a book attack. D5 and e5 are moves that have been examined, previously in master level games. So that can be a helpful guideline in terms of learning what to play. Takes e5, knight takes e5, queen to d6, rook to e1, queen to f6. And yeah, I think overall here, white's looking fine. This creates some problems. So queen to f3, yeah, I think there become some issues for white here. Instead, I think... So let's just see the tactic. Bishop to d4 is allowed after queen to d3, or queen to f3. I think instead bishop to f3 might be a better play, but bishop to d4 was a winning... they're considering queen takes f3 to be a missed win because of the lack of defense of d4. Bishop to b5, and white's looking fine. So black is down by a lot. Or black is up by a lot, sorry. Yeah, overall I think this ends up being a pretty good situation for white. Let's go through this again. E4, E5, and then this early bishop to B4. So far I like this. This is a book attack. It's one that we know to be good for white. Queen D6 is an error. Rook to E1 seizes this open file and defends the knight. It's a very versatile move. It does a lot of good things for white's position. Rook E1. So that was a better response, or that was the response. Okay, cool. Yeah, Rook E1 is a good response to Queen to D6. Queen to F3 is an error, allowing Bishop to D4. And yeah, that's an issue. So yeah, in terms of ways to have improved this game, I guess I would mainly be focused on like improve basically bishop to or queen to f3 was an error hanging the rook. So this is a basic tactical error. This is something that should be ironed out of the game. I think we're barely out of opening theory, to be honest. But rook e1 was a good play, but queen to f3 is a tactical mistake. Bishop to b5 and yeah, knight to d2, rook takes, and things are fine for white. Or sorry, things are fine for black. Losing that rook was really important. Yeah, so I think honestly that might have been decisive. I was looking for some type of change that makes the situation better for white, but I actually think things just get really problematic. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I think that there really wasn't much play after bishop to d4. The thing about this, these pre-planned attacks is that the position gets relatively simplified relatively early. So, so doing something like hanging a rook in this situation. So here, allowing this bishop to d4 threat loses a piece immediately for white. And after that, I think white's really in trouble. So, yeah, so I guess that's a large overarching thematic thing to look at here. Really consider, in this Evans Gambit, if you're going to be playing the Evans Gambit, this bishop to d4 threat is not something that can be underestimated. This bishop to d4 threat comes up twice in this game. So after queen to f3, bishop to d4 is already playable. That, so that's the first time bishop to d4 can be played. And the second time is after bishop takes f3, basically on bishop to h4, on bishop to g5, white forfeits the tempo that is going to allow bishop to d4 to be played. So yeah, so that's an error. White should be more aware of this threat on bishop to d4. That threat was enough to shift this game. That threat was available twice, and it's a theme that white really needs to be more kind of careful. Like in terms of this Evans Gambit, the Evans Gambit gets a strong center at the risk of this d4 a1 diagonal. So this d4 a1 diagonal is something that white is going to have to be very conscious of. Rook to e1 is a great move, but bishop to b2 queen to f3 can't be the follow-up here because it allows bishop to d4. There does need to be something to defend against f3, to defend against threats on f2. I think the best move is queen to d2. Rook to e2 is also possible, but I understand that you need to come up with a defensive move against f2. But it's not queen to f3. It's either rook to e2 or queen to d2. Those are the only two that hold on to both f2 and pay attention to the d4 square. So that was a big thing that happened in this game. Basically this is a situation that you need to be, very aware of and careful of. But yeah, interesting things. It shows the value of the bishop to d4 tactic in the Evans Gambit. And you really need to be careful with this kind of thing. Queen to d2 is better, rook to e2 is better, and yeah. Yep. After this, I don't think white ever gets any successful counterplay in this game. So that's this has been helpful. I mean, it's been a good opportunity to look at some Evans Gambit to look at some Evans Gambit theory. But yeah, thematically here, white needs to pay attention to the bishop to d4 threat. This is available to white, or available as a tactical resource for black, and white needs to defend against it in the Evans Gambit. Up to here, I think everything was good. White's showing a 3-pawn advantage after rook to e1. Queen to d6 was not the correct move here. The book move instead, knight to f6. But this gives a big eval advantage to white. And white does need to play accurately in from a defensive perspective. Maybe rook to e2 and then bishop to b2 the next move maybe. Either way, probably bishop to b2 the next move no matter what. But white's in a good situation here, so it's disappointing to see the bishop come in on d4 and win big tactically. Yeah, so here, bishop to b2. It's more important to get this position to be safe than to keep your pawn structure preserved. You're up. I think you're up. Well, actually, in this situation, black's already equalized. But bishop to d4 is going to be a lasting threat, and one that you have to pay attention to in the Evans Gambit. So that's the biggest takeaway from this game. So looking a little bit more, closing out just with a little bit more of an analysis on Evans Gambit theory. 3 moves here: bishop a5, bishop c5, bishop e7. No matter what, you play d4 on the next move. White does. And here, on the bishop a5 line where pawn takes d4 is not a possibility. The main line for white is castles. Then black has a bunch of choices. With most of them, white can retake on d4. On d takes c3, queen to b3, and then you are in some kind of well-developed theory in this situation, so you need to be careful. But castles, bishop to b6, c takes d4, d6, and then d5. And this provides a main, basically a pre-established threat. This e5 simplifying the center, but getting a ton of space for white. d5 on knight a5, which is the main move. You play bishop to b2 and have this this threat on g7 available. So hopefully that's a good a good kind of general overview. d4 is always playable in the Evans Gambit. That's a big takeaway from this. And then after most moves here, you retake on d4. So d6, pawn takes d4, and let's just go through them. Knight e7, I think c takes d4 is still the best for white. And on bishop to b6, c takes d4. And pretty much on everything. Knight f6 is kind of the most immediately challenging. Knight to f6, you play e5. This is complicated line. So on knight to e4 here, I mean, this can get into some interesting stuff. You do need to be a little bit careful on knight f6. Knight f6 is actually, it's well down the list, but it's actually given as the best engine line. In this case, I think you can't immediately take pawn takes d4. You have to play e5. But there's some very interesting theory here, and theory that can potentially be good for white. Overall, as a takeaway from this game, watch out for the bishop to d4 threat. There were twice in this game it was allowed, so I think that that sort of reflects that it might be helpful in your understanding to pay more attention to it. But interesting, 2 Evans Gambit games. I think that was helpful. It was helpful for me to refresh this stuff because it's been years since I've seen the Evans Gambit. But yeah, thank you very much for sending the games in, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here on the stream. And yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the help with that. And next stream is at 9:35 p.m. Eastern tonight. Should be some more good games. And yeah, everyone, please have a good day. Thank you. Bye.